All right, welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Hi, hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Depends on which time zone you are in right now. I believe for this session, we are joined in from a lot of places all across the globe. So welcome everyone. So on behalf of Team Up, I'd like to welcome all of you to yet another episode of Founder, which is a program focused on women leadership, aiming to build a pipeline of women leaders from the classroom into the tech world. Today I have a very special speaker with us, a dear friend and a colleague of mine, Jiezhen Wu. So she is basically a connector, a collaborator, a change maker. She was most recently an Equity and Inclusion Fellow and part of the Mindful Leaders Collective at Harvard University, where she just completed her master's in education with a focus on leadership and inclusion in organizations. And before Harvard, she worked in the social innovation and social impact space. She led a social enterprise media platform in Asia that facilitated global summits and did a lot of different events in Singapore. She's also a global facilitator and a change maker for Ashoka's Changemaker Exchange initiative, and she holds a degree in positive psychology. She's also a certified yoga teacher and a positive psychology coach. And to top it all off, she's also a TED Talk speaker where she talked about how communities and social issues and different people need to basically come from a place of positivity and strength. So thank you, Jay. I hope I did justice to your introduction. You've been busy over these past few years, and a lot of it kind of gives me, I've had the pleasure of meeting you in person, and we've spent a good amount of time together. So I know that there's a lot of positivity that comes out from your presence, and I hope that we can spread that today in this session as well. So welcome, and glad to have you finally here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Honored to be here.
Thank you. All right, so folks, on our previous episode of Founder, we had Diana here. She talked about what holds women back at workplaces and in their daily lives. And while we discussed the external factors and internal barriers that held us back in this society, in Pakistan especially, today we will be focusing on how we can be more inclusive leaders and inspire a more courageous and inclusive world with our very own Jiezhen Wu. For me, inclusive leadership basically means someone who is aware of their own biases and their preferences, and as actively seeking out and considering other people's views and difference of opinions, perspectives, in order to have and inform better decision making. But then again, I would also like to know what makes people feel included in organizations, what makes them feel that they are treated fairly and respected and valued, or that they belong to that organization. According to an HBR study, leaders, basically what they say, what they do, makes up to 70% of difference as to whether an individual in that organization reports that they feel included. So for me personally, this really matters because the more people feel included, the more they speak up and go the extra mile and collaborate with each other as well. So anyway, I'm really excited to know more about inclusive leadership from Jai, and I would definitely love to pick her brain on this topic. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this episode, and I'm really thrilled to have you here. My first question to you would be, so tell me a bit about your life story, your experiences that inspired you to pursue leadership and inclusion as a study. And then according to you, what do you think does it mean to be an inclusive leader?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And thanks for that great introduction and setting the context. Yeah, I think for me in particular, so I grew up in Singapore, so I grew up in Asia. And, it was, Singapore was a great place to grow up in, and I think it was, offered me a great education. And yet there was part of me that was always asking, how do we create this sense of belonging? We want to create excellence in schools, in workplaces, right? But how do we also have people feel like they have a voice and that they can do something about it? I think growing up in Singapore, we had a lot of things provided for us. I think our government had a lot of great policies that made sure that people were taken care of, but yet there was almost this over-reliance, like we expected the government to do everything.
Yeah.
But I think when you feel included and you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourselves, that's when you feel like you can actually be part of, making a small difference in your own community or in the community around you. And so I grew up in Singapore, but then I ended up going to the US to study for several years and then end up working there as well. So I think having this, and I realized it wasn't just, I think an issue in Asia, but also in the US. And it's like a global thing that people, I think as human beings, more than anything, we want to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, whether that's our immediate neighborhood, our community, our school community, our workplace, or even across the world. And yeah, so from working, living, in Singapore, in the US, I also spent some time in France. I think I realized that this was something that I cared a lot about. I think I've always personally always looked for the people on the sidelines, like who's not at the table, whose voices are not being included. And I think it was important for me very early on, even as I started doing work in community very early in my life. And I was always noticing, like, why are there only certain people who feel like they can volunteer? Like, do you have to be of a certain background to feel like you can contribute to the world? Why doesn't everyone feel like that they have a space or that they feel like it's their place to contribute? And I think that comes a lot with inclusion, to feel like you're included in shaping a world rather than waiting for it to happen. But I think it's how do you create that environment in spaces is the big question. And I think right now more than ever, it's a really important question that a lot of people are thinking about.
That's true. And I think at the end of the day, equality also matters. If you feel like the other person is equal to you, that's where inclusivity also comes from at the end of the day. In your opinion, what are some of the signature traits of an inclusive leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think my opinion has definitely been formed by a lot of other scholars, academics out there, at the Harvard Business School. So I spent the program that I was in this year as an equity inclusion fellow looked at this work from a multidimensional perspective, because I think we cannot solve problems from like one dimension. In education, when we think about inclusive education, a lot of the time we're also looking at, like disabilities and how we have people of differing abilities and how we include them in different spaces, right? But I think in the workplace, a lot of the times inclusion is different voices, different perspectives, different trades at the business school. So my program was at the school education, the business school, and the public policy school, because we really wanted to be able to look at these issues from a multidimensional, interdisciplinary perspective. Because I think that's we're going to look at complex problems in the issues in the world today, we need complex and robust solutions as well. But out of the Harvard Business Review, and this article was published, I think, earlier this year and also 2-3 years ago. So this work's been around for a while, but I think it's only beginning to be noticed a bit more especially in the current like time in history we're in, with a lot of the uprisings and protests and people saying like, we need a voice, and a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. But yeah, so at the business school, they're talking about visible commitment, humility, awareness of bias, curiosity about others, cultural intelligence, effective collaboration. And I think all these are terminology, right? And I think the important thing is like how we make sense of it in our own lives. And for me in particular, I think an inclusive leader is someone that knows how to listen to not only the words that are being said, but what is not being said. Like, how do you really sit down and connect with someone, and not listening for just the sake of listening, but listening to empathize, listening to see possibility. Because I think what a lot of people struggle with in inclusive leadership is like, okay, the frustrations of I need to get everyone to the table, but then what? Like, what do I do with that? But I think being able to listen in order to really empathize and come from that place of, okay, now that I've heard, what can I do with this? And working in collaboration, I think is so important, because, a lot of the times I think as leaders, and particularly, I don't know, for me also as a woman leader, I tend to put a lot of things on myself and expect like, I can do this, like, and carry the burden of an organization or a community. But I think it's really how do we work together in each other's lived experiences, because we have such different experiences, even if we're in the same place, to make things happen.
Yeah. And what about, so, I mean, I understand for the past year you've been studying and learning a lot about this subject, but in your opinion, I mean, in this field of study, what has changed in the past 5 years? And do you expect or predict that in the next 5 to 10 years, will all of this change? Will this actually be a topic that is widely going to be talked about, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think so the work I think has actually been around for a while, but its relevance has increased considerably in the last few years. So one of the courses I was engaging with and participating in at the business school this year is the first time they actually taught this class. It was called Leading Difference, and it was taught by Francesca Gino and Francis Fry, amazing scholars, academics, and practitioners as well. But it was, I think in the business world for a long time, this was part of the conversation, but not as of such importance. And even at the Graduate School of Education, I think Harvard had started its diversity, the Office of Diversity, probably only in the last 5-6 years. It's been a part of the work. I think people know that it's important, but I think it's only in the last 5 years, and even more important, like I think in present day that we're in, that people have really put an importance on this and put the resources and put the energy behind it, which I think is very exciting. I think it's an opportunity, and it's not just in business right now, it's in government, in public policy, in startups. A lot of startups are looking at this now because they're like, it affects people and culture. It affects, workplace productivity. It affects like your overall growth trajectory. If you get this stuff right early and you set that context and the culture where people feel, that they're included, and it's not just in the US, especially, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. But, a lot of people say we should have started with inclusion, because diversity doesn't normally beget inclusion, but inclusion most of the time will beget diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think it's really exciting, I think, to be in this time. I think at the same time, I'm sure for a lot of people in this space, it's frustrating that it's taken so long for people to take it, more seriously.
It's a little different than our more developed countries. I feel like we're still getting there when it comes to inclusivity, diversity. I mean, our organizations are still at that point. But what do you think will happen in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, I feel like it's definitely something people are going to be talking about and improving within their organizations.
Yeah, no, I think it's because it affects so many things. It's not like a standalone piece of the work. I think it affects just overall morale. It affects, people and how they feel committed to the work that they're doing. If you feel, if you feel welcomed, if you feel that you belong in a space, the way you interact with a space is going to be completely different.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, yes, I think what we need to think about, I think especially for me, being Asian, growing up in Asia, is that not just to take a lot of these concepts from the US, but to make it our own, in our own cultural context and what that means in the world that we live in. I think in Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, like growing up, I felt like, who has access to make the world a better place? I remember so I ran an organization called The Hidden Good in Singapore. It was a media platform and a social enterprise. And I remember, one of our youth, he grew up on the autism spectrum, and he said he always felt like he was a beneficiary in the way the world is. But but our organization was really big on building these spaces of inclusion. And he felt like, oh, I can finally be part of the change. I don't need to wait for, people to come and help me and feel like I have to be on the waiting game the whole time. But he became a community leader. He worked on social impact projects. And, he was like, I can be a hero for like hope, courage, and strength. He's still one of the most inspiring people, that I always think about when I think about this work. Because if we include everyone, they can make changes wherever they are. And I think this is, especially, I think we need to also think about what this looks like in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods, because it's going to look different in every organization, the little details, but the essence of it is still the same.
That's true. And looking at it from a women's perspective, how can we inspire courage in ourselves and in others, obviously, to create a more just and inclusive world? How do we take that step?
Yeah, I think, I think, and this is, what the title of this talk was called, was the possibility playbook, right? I think a lot of times when we're trying to make change, it can be scary because, it's changing the way that we've always done things, and people will be like, oh, it's always been this way. But coming from that place of possibility actually gives us a lot of courage to play with, and that's why it's called the playbook, right? Because it's not a fixed set of
Not a
rules.
manual.
It's
Yeah.
not a manual. It's like, if you're playing sports or something, you're like, okay, I'm not sure what is going to happen, but I can think about like where I want to go. And it's a fluid thing. And I think courage, and there's always this quote that sticks with me, that courage is not the absence of fear. It's feeling fear and doing it anyways, because the fear is always going to be there. For me, I have like major imposter syndrome sometimes, when I sometimes when you asked me to give this talk, I was like, oh no, what if like no one shows up? What if no one's interested in what I have to say? And it's so real,
Yeah,
I
it
think
is, definitely.
particularly, and research has shown that women in particularly feel this even more, that sense
Women
of,
go find self-doubt, I believe, more than men. I mean, I don't know, I don't
yeah.
mean to stereotype or anything, but
Yeah, but I think there is that gendered element of it, but it doesn't have to limit us, because I think most of the time it's about leading with courage, and I think leading with courage inspires courage, and
that,
creating space. I think for me also being real and being authentic. I think my team knows that I'm not afraid to show my emotions, and emotions are not about being weak. It's about being human and being whole and being strong. And that, I think, showing up as your whole self at work as a leader gives your team permission to know that they can show up as their whole selves as well. Because it's
that is,
like you said, it's your actions and your words, and everything needs to be aligned. If I'm saying one thing, I'll be like, okay, guys, you can be who you are at work, and I'm not showing up as completely who I
yeah.
am.
I mean,
It's
you
at odds.
shouldn't really put your own self back at home and bring another self at the door when you come to your workplace. It should be just you, the way you are.
Yeah, I know Simon Sinek always talks about bringing your full self, to work and feeling safe, and that psychological safety is part of inclusion as well. It's how do we get people to feel safe at work and in their, in their communities, so that they can do the best work possible, because we have so much potential in us. I think most of the time, I know this for myself personally, I tend to be the thing that's like holding myself back. And I think if we play in the space of possibility rather than limitation, we give ourselves a much wider range of options. Because if we're always starting to be like, okay, these are my limited like number of hours in a day, for instance, right? And we're like, these are my limited options, and let me see what I can do from there. We only go to like maybe like here, right? But if we come from that place of possibly like, okay, what's if everything was possible, what could I do? And then scale it back to the current reality, we would be so much further along. And I think this can be applied to like strategy, and can be applied to even how we communicate. It can be applied to so many different aspects of our work.
Yeah, that's true. And it leads to my next question. A bit of it you've answered already, but how can we learn to lead from that place of possibility, like making small changes and learning to lead from the place of possibility rather than limitations, in approaching life in general and leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a mindset. So it's not something that, I suddenly play from the place of possibility and I have all the answers. But it's really that work in progress, and a mindset that, and recognizing that it's this journey. But I think it gives us so many more paths that we could possibly take. Like, especially when we're thinking of how can we create a more inclusive workplace. I think a lot of people, sometimes the resistance comes from, oh no, I have to make so many changes. Oh no, I have to do this. Oh no, like, but if we're like, what would be possible if we had a more inclusive workplace? And it's just reframing the question sometimes. I think in leadership coaching and stuff, it's often about the powerful questions, and that we can ask ourselves, that we can ask our team. And yeah, and it could start with even as small as, on like, I used to have monthly one-on-ones with my team, and I would often ask them these questions like, what do you think is working for you right now? What could be different? And what's, what are you grateful for? But also what's possible in your journey right now? Where do you want to go? And remembering to to take that step back and dream and not get caught up in the day-to-day operations. Because I think it's so easy as entrepreneurs, as people doing the work, to get caught up in that. One of the best piece of advice one of my board members gave me when I first started out leading the last organization I was a part of was to create dream time every week. And I was like, what is this dream time? And it was like, she was like, set aside 2 hours every week where you just don't block it, like don't do anything, and sit there and use it as a time to like take that pause. And I think, it's also giving ourselves the time and space to take that step back and ask ourselves, what am I doing right? What could I be doing different? Like what's possible in my work right now? Because if not, it's really easy to just get caught up in the motions of each
That's
day.
true. I think breaking the momentum once every now and then is really important, especially in your workplace as well. What are some of the common misconceptions people have when it comes to talking about inclusive leadership, and how can we combat those?
Yeah, I think people I think people worry that inclusive leadership means, they won't get things done because they have to include every single voice. I think that's one of the concerns I usually hear is like, how am I supposed to include everyone? Like, how is that humanly possible? But I think it's really more how people feel that they are part of an organization. There are very, the big ways and small ways, depending on the size of your organization, of the nature of your work, that you can find ways to create inclusive environment. It's creating more of inclusive environment. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to have a say on like, you know, what type of like toilet paper you're using, like in the small things, but it's like really how do you create an environment where people feel like what you said earlier, people feel that safe
It
enough to speak
matters.
up, that they
Yeah,
feel like they matter, that they feel like, they're not just a number or a statistic, that
that's
because I think diversity, when we talk about diversity, is like how do we get diverse voices, diverse representation, diverse perspective, which is really important. But inclusion is really, that ability for people to feel safe, to feel, to feel like welcome, to feel celebrated, and to feel like cherished as part of their work. And that is Francis Fry at Harvard Business School talks about the inclusion dial. Like, how do we turn the dial up? If I can just do one thing today as a manager and as a leader to turn the dial up for someone to feel more safe, more welcome, more celebrated, and more cherished and included as part of their work, what might be one action I can do to do that? It might be just a check-in in the hallway. It doesn't have to always be like a really big like policy change, because sometimes when we wait for policy change, it takes a very long time to happen. But how do we
yeah.
prototype like day to day? How do we create spaces in which people feel they're seen and heard and that they can contribute fully as themselves?
So knowing all that you know now, do you remember any experience that you wished in which you wish you would have done something differently? And if you were to do it all over again, what would you change?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely a lot of things that, I think when I look back, okay, I wouldn't have done different things so differently because I think a lot of the missteps have, made me
Made you
who
who
I
you
am,
are,
and
yeah, of
I've
course.
grown so much from them.
Yeah.
Um, but I think one of the things I remember, there was one of the members in our youth community, and I remember I did get very frustrated because I felt like he wasn't being inclusive. And and I realized that inclusion is not something you can force on someone. It's something that you have. That's why I talked about inspiring courage, right? To create a more inclusive world. It's something that you need to, I think, inspire in people to see why it matters. Why does it? And I think what I would have done differently was to connect with him. Like, when has he felt included? When has he felt excluded? No one likes to feel excluded. I think, personally, for me growing up, there were certain times that in the world that I feel different. I feel like, out of the norm. Just by even the different paths that I've taken in life from my peers. And feeling different is one thing, but knowing that someone sees you and someone sees your strengths, and I would have done, I think, rather than being like, why don't you get this inclusion thing? I think, and trying to be like, and getting frustrated with it. Yeah, I think it would be to connect with him and ask him like, so when have you felt included? When have you felt excluded? And, you know, how might you want to lead knowing this, knowing how you felt as a individual as well. Yeah.
And what is there any sort of, I mean, you've given lots of advice, you've given lots of golden words. I feel like I've actually, to be honest, it's a good refresher for me too. But I feel like, is there one piece of practical advice you would like to give to women out there, especially who are listening in, who would like to build themselves to become more better leaders and more inclusive leaders? So any piece of advice that you'd like to give them?
Yeah, I think it starts from having real conversations with your team and also the communities and the audience you're trying to serve. I think it's about sitting down, and I was surprised. So I quite early on, when I started leading the Hidden Good, one of my board members was like, you should do one-on-ones with like everyone on your team, and not one-on-ones just to check on their performance and their progress, but to check on who they are as
Yeah.
people. And so it was a lot more of like professional and personal development time and building a relationship, I think, than just like, okay, where are we on your targets right now. And really, I think that it starts with the human relationship. I think if that practical tip, if you can just put aside 1 hour a week, 1 hour a week can make a huge difference. I think 1 hour a week can really transform the way you operate as a leader and the way organizations run as well. If you can take 1 hour a week and connect with one person, or if you can create 1 hour a week and start like a mentoring program where all the senior staff in your company, in your organization, mentor junior staff, right? There are so many different ways that you can take that 1 hour. I think just start with 1 hour and just ask myself, how can I use this as a time to create conversations, to create connection, to create listening in my organization, so that people feel that courage to show up as who they are and to bring their best ideas and to bring their best selves to work and to the places in which that we engage in. Yeah.
All right. Um, there are a couple of poll questions. We'd obviously, in this session, we really wanted to engage the audience as well. We just didn't want this to be a two-sided conversation. So we're going to ask you a couple of poll questions. I think it's in progress right now. The first question is, what trait or which trait do you think is the most important for an inclusive leader? We're getting mixture of answers now. So the options are courage, open-mindedness, cultural intelligence, commitment, and collaboration. So far, commitment has gotten zero interest, but
no, there's one now. Yeah.
There's one now. So open-mindedness, I think, based on the culture that we live in, I think open-mindedness is the first one and the most liked one. In their opinion, which is, I mean, somewhat, yes, it is true. But yeah, so open-mindedness is getting 56%, and then cultural intelligence, 28%. And I think that's about the end of our poll. Is it? I think it is. Yep. So we landed with open-mindedness, which is the most important trait according to our audience that a leader should have, an inclusive leader should have. We'll do another round of polls in a bit. Guys, I have some questions here by you all, so I just want to make sure that I do justice. I have Meh Batul. She's asking, what is the key point of leadership and how can we lead better?
Yeah, no, I think that's, and I think this is really like, there are so many definitions of leadership. I'll share one that I really like. But I think it's for you to determine what that key point of leadership is for yourself. Similarly with, I really like the poll question. I mean, all those answers, I think are great. And those components are all important, but it's what really matters in the context that you're in, because whether it's a cultural context, national context, or even your home context, right? Or the spaces that we're in, it's about meeting people where they are and what the moment needs. So I think it's about, and with, the point of leadership is also about what does the society, what is the world that I'm embedded in right now need? But one of my favorite definitions, and I'm talking so much about, Frances Frye this morning, but she's been a great inspiration. She just had a book come out as well. But she talks about leadership as making people better in your presence and leaving them better in your absence. So a lot of the times we think of leadership as like, I have to be there to make people better. But how can you also make people better even in your absence? Which I think is a really powerful thing, because sometimes we have this like hero mentality of leadership where we think we have to be the ones to make the change. But how do you also make yourself obsolete in the process where people will be better whether or not, you are around? And I think that courage in order to do that, to say like, I'm going to set people up for success so that, they'll have the courage to lead. It takes courage to do that, to be like, okay, I'm learning to let go, which I think for me was a really big part of that as well. Yeah.
Okay. We have a really interesting question here from Shahbaz Khan. He's asking how is inclusive leadership different from transactional leadership? Are they not the same?
I'm not know if I'm curious what you mean by transactional leadership. I'm not sure if you could say more about that, because
Maybe
I just wanted to understand what
Shahbaz,
you're.
if you could type in a question again and explain what you mean by transactional leadership, maybe we can then answer this question. All right. What is the difference between, okay, I think this is more towards the experience. What is the difference between experience of studying from a Harvard education as compared to Asian universities? And it's being asked by Muhammad Mahmood Aslam.
Yeah, I think thanks for that question. I mean, I think when I was thinking about furthering my studies, I was thinking like, should I do it in Asia? Because the work that I want to be doing long term, I think, is in Asia. I think for me, it was really the people I would be surrounded by, because I think Harvard attracts such a diverse range of people from all across the U.S., but all across the world as well. And I think for me, that was the richness of perspectives that I really wanted to be exposed to and to be engaged in. And also because I think of how a university like Harvard is set up, like I mentioned, I did some of my work and took classes at the graduate school education, but also at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy and the business school. That kind of setup allowed me to move between spaces and to make, it wasn't so fixed in a particular path or trajectory that sometimes I find, in Asian universities, it's more like very focused as opposed to more interdisciplinary. So I think that for me was it. And I think also the range of speakers that come, the different events that happen on campus, a lot of it, which, as we know right now in COVID, a lot of things have moved online. But I think the exposure, I think that was what I was looking for to broaden my world, my mind, help me connect the dots. Because I think in my work, I've been, I think fortunate enough to experience a lot of different experiences in terms of, working in different countries and spaces, but it allowed me to really take a step back and make sense of that, which I really appreciate. Yeah.
Right. We have another one from Shayan Shalwani. I hope I pronounced that right. Do you think it's important for women to look back after their family, as has been a traditional role, hand in hand with leadership roles in society, or should they go with one?
Which question was this?
It's
Shayan, yeah. Do you find it important for women to look after their family? I mean, this is a really interesting, I think question, especially as we think about, how we want to show up as women in the current day and age that we're in. Personally, for me, so I got married 3 years ago. My husband and I just celebrated our 3-year anniversary. And, this is something that we're thinking about as we consider the next chapter of our lives together. How do we want to be? And I think, for me, in our relationship with my husband, Jared, he's probably tuning in this call in our room right now, but I think having a supportive partner is such a big part of the I think being able to do the work. Like, my husband has been the one that has nudged me whenever I've doubted myself. Like, I think, a lot of the opportunity, even applying to Harvard, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to get in, like my last role as executive director, I was like, I don't know if I should do this. What if I'm not qualified? And that voice of self-doubt that I told you, that is so real. And I really want to be upfront with that, because I want to normalize the fact that it's part of being human. I think looking after family comes with finding a support, and I know for a lot of my friends in Pakistan, family is a really big thing as well. And leaning on family, I think women need to, for me at least, I need to learn that I don't have to do it alone. That I have a partner that I can lean on for support, but also to lean on my family. I just had a call with my mom, on Monday, just because I felt like I just needed, to talk to her and to and she's back in Singapore right now, and to talk to her and then to get her perspective and advice on certain things and to ask for support. I think for me, I've just gotten so used to kind of being independent and doing this stuff. I need to remember that I can also ask for support. But I think, yeah, I think we're reshaping what this traditional role looks like, that you can be, a great mother or wife and also be a successful leader. And I think it's for us to look at the fact that leadership doesn't have to look a certain way. It doesn't have to look like, we don't have to become male leaders. That's not the aspiration. But like, how can we become women who lead in a world that, if you look at COVID right now, a lot of the countries and cities and spaces that have been handling the COVID situation pretty well are led by women. And what is the difference that we're bringing to that? And that's a really interesting question to ask ourselves, I think, especially in this time.
I just got a really interesting question from Saira Salim as well. She's asking, is leadership closely related to management, and how?
Yeah, I think this, and I do see someone wrote, a response to the transactional leadership thing. And I think this is like, if there's one thing I want, I think people take away today from this is that leadership doesn't have to look a certain way. And I think there's, especially in management schools, whether in the business school, I took a whole class on the leadership system at the public policy, Kennedy School of Public Policy as well. And we were having this whole conversation about, is leadership management? Some people say it's different. Some people say it's a Venn diagram and it's embedded in between. I think the most important thing after reading all of this and learning all of this is to ask yourself, how does it make sense in my life? There are days that I've had to turn up the dial on the leadership dial and be like, okay, I need to hold the vision and the strategy and the courage for people to show up. And there's some days I need to be to put on the management hat. And I think it's asking ourselves, what hat do I need to put on in this moment? Similar to the poll question you asked earlier, what is the most important trait? It's like, what is the most important trait for this moment? And that comes with being mindful, that mindfulness leadership that we talked about. It's about being present in the moment, asking, what does this moment need right now? Does it require more of me to show up as, a leader and manager? And maybe I need to be both at the same time. And that's okay too. But yes, I think they're similar but different. And it depends on who you ask, because so many people have different perspectives on this, and that's okay too. It doesn't have to look a certain way.
Faith Lau is saying, I find myself sometimes drained from having many one-on-one conversations as well as follow-up conversations, creating the inclusive environment. How do you remain grounded and energized when there's so much work being an inclusive leader?
Yeah, I think it's how you see the work. I think I've definitely felt that on days, especially when I think early on in my career, I went to put one-on-one meetings all one day back to back. And that was probably not the best idea. So I think one thing is to space it out, because even like for me, I think I'm naturally extroverted. So being with people does energize me, but there comes a point where it's too much. I just need to take a break. So firstly, I think knowing your comfort level of what energizes you. If you think maybe doing 1 or 2 a day, there's a technical aspects of it. And we talk about technical leadership and adaptive leadership, right? Technical is the solution. Maybe just do 1 or 2 a day. But the adaptive leadership piece is how do I want to engage in this interaction with someone? Do I feel like it's something I have to do to be an inclusive leader? Or am I genuinely interested and curious about, we come in with that mindset of I'm really curious about how my team has been doing in this time, and connecting with them as a peer and as a collaborator, as opposed to a supervisor and a superior, can change the dynamic of how you feel as well, that you don't feel it's a obligation or responsibility, but it helps you also deepen your relationship with someone. And that comes back tenfold. I think investing in relationships is one of the best things that we can do as leaders, as change makers, as collaborators, and not investing in them for the sake of investing in them, but really because I think we care about the people around us, and that comes back to us tenfold. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a really controversial question here, though. I mean, so
Okay, sure.
where did it go? Oh, wait. Um, so it's by Dr. Komal Khadim Hussain. She's asking, in your opinion, who has more capabilities for leadership, man or woman?
I
I
mean, this is definitely not a black and white answer, but I think it's an important question that we need to ask ourselves, because it's also, we look at history, right? Like, I think
yeah,
for the longest time ever, people used to think that men were more capable as leaders, or by just looking at results, right? Like that was the reality of the number of Fortune 500 CEOs, the number of tech, even people in tech and like startups,
yeah,
right? Um, but I think it's less so about which gender is better, but who is better for the role. Like, I
yeah,
think we need to look at culture fit, and job fit, and who is, and it's interesting too, because even in men and women, there are men that have more feminine attributes and women that have more masculine attributes, and that's okay too. I think we all bring our unique gifts to the spaces and the work that we're in. Um, but I think it's less so men or women, but more about the person and looking at their values. They align with the work that they're doing.
yeah,
But I do think the world that we live in right now does require, um, if we look at, for instance, going back to the COVID example and how like a lot of the situations that have handled this better,
yeah.
and countries that have handled this better have been led by women. We got to look at ourselves there and ask like, what worked there and what are we missing, you know? And not to make it become this like biased binary of like, oh, because they're women, they're more nurturing and they care about the community, that's why this happened, and to extrapolate that, but to ask ourselves like, what worked there, and to bring that into, we can bring that into our own lives, into our organizations.
True.
I think personally for me, like tapping into more of that, I think that feminine energy that I have is also, it also makes you more accessible, more approachable, maybe, and playing around with that, like I said, it's a possibility playbook, right? It's really, how do we play with these things moment to moment to find out how
And
we
what
can be
works?
our best selves for the world. I
Yeah.
also do want to go back to the question about transactional leadership, because I
Yeah,
know,
yeah. I mean, and we're getting a lot of questions. I want to do justice to all of them. So Furkan Qureshi answered the question earlier. Transactional leadership is a style of leadership in which leaders promote compliance by followers through both rewards and punishments. Through a rewards and punishment system, transactional leaders are able to keep followers motivated for the short term.
yeah. So I think in leadership studies, right, a lot of the times we go into the terminology, but it's. I think I would like to invite us to look beyond the terminology. Clear. I think just reading off this definition of transactional leadership, it seems very different from inclusive leadership, just by where the intention is. Because the transactional leadership is like, okay, I'm going to give you rewards, or let's see, where did it go? Yeah, I'm going to give you like rewards or punishments in order for you to do something. But inclusive leadership comes from the place of more like, I want to create a space in which every voice, every person feels like, that they're safe and welcomed and they're seen and heard, so that they can do the best work possible. But I'm not doing this with the intention of like promoting compliance. Like, I'm trying to make the most robust workplace that is alive with innovation and creativity and solutions, so that when we come up with problems, that everyone feels that they have a place to be able to voice ideas, that and that creates that richness of dialogue, but also of coming up with solutions and ideas that will make the world better where it is. So I think it's a very different intention, which creates a different kind of result. And even in leadership, we also got to ask ourselves, like, what is our intention? Like, why are we doing what we're doing? So I think the why is fundamentally different between transactional and inclusive leadership, even though maybe they're trying to produce, like, we're trying to create, motivation. But there's so many ways to create motivation. And this is it sounds like, even in this question, the person suggests posing this question, it says it's pretty short term. I think if we want to build a long-term culture that is sustainable and that is vibrant and alive and collaborative and creative, I'm not saying inclusive leadership is the only answer, but it's definitely one of the elements of the tools in your arsenal as a leader that I would encourage a lot of people to employ.
Thank you. So I keep getting comments from people that this is a very informative session. It's a very good session. I'm glad people are liking it. We're just going to take a couple of more questions. I'm just going to do a quick time check. We do have time. Okay. So let's take a couple of more questions. There was one that seemed really, really interesting. How can leaders keep their employees and colleagues motivated all the time, especially when there is too much workload? By Sayal Khan.
Yeah, so I think going back to the why, right? And if you haven't heard Simon Sinek, I highly recommend watching he has like many TED Talks, great book, Start With Why as well. I think we have to ask ourselves like where motivation comes from, right? And I think it's not motivation. There's the short-term motivation to reach targets, to hit goals, but where does that deeper motivation come from? And starting internally with like, how do we actually know why our employees are here? And actually, I would love to, there's a chat button at the bottom. I would like to know why everyone is here. You could have been anywhere else during this hour. You could have been with your families. You could have been eating. You could have been sleeping. You could have been, scrolling on Facebook or Instagram. Like, why are you here? And if you could put that in the chat box, whether you're on Facebook, tuning in from Facebook or Zoom, why did you want to be here for this hour with us? Like, what were you hoping to learn?
Yeah.
And yeah, so if you click on chat at the bottom and type that in, or on Facebook, typing that into the comment section, I think we would love to hear that. But that's a simple question that you can actually ask your employees. There are so many other companies that you could be at, like, why are you here? And why is this work that you signed up to do important? And yes, sometimes it's a practical thing. It's like, I just needed to feed my family, but that might be strong enough of a motivator to get people to remember like why this matters to them. Like, what are they doing this for? They're doing this for their family. They could be doing this for themselves. They could be doing this for their future. Like, this is a field that I want to go in, and I'm okay to take maybe a lower ranking role so that I could take my next step strategically in my career path as well. So I think it's getting connected to that why, which I think is often missing in organizations. And actually connecting to the why helps people feel that they're seen and heard, and goes back to being that, creating that space of inclusivity at the workplace as well.
That is purpose as well. Khatija is asking a question. She's asking, what profession do you think would excel in times to come, a must-have skill needed for the future?
Yeah, so I think professions that, I think will excel in the future, it's a fascinating question, because being in the education space, we talk about this a lot, the future of education, the future of work. And I think what we found is that, and I'm sure you've heard this statistic, I think it's like 50% of the jobs that children, the children today will have, don't even exist yet. Honestly, my job probably did not exist when I was in school, and the world is changing at such a phenomenal rate that it's not so much the jobs that, we think will be relevant, but the skills. I think it's the skill set, and more importantly than the skill set, the mindset. I think because you can have the skills, but if we don't have like the mindset to, we could have all the skills, right? Maybe to be an inclusive leader, but we don't have the mindset to actually implement that and to embody that. Another space that's really interesting is that space of embodied leadership. How do we not just know this in our heads, but also in our hearts and our bodies, and how we move in the world? And I think it's really more of what mindset is necessary. I'm sure, you've heard of like, a lot of you might have heard of Carol Dweck's growth mindset. And I think it started in education, but it's been applied to parenting, been applied to, the workplace and corporate culture, but also in tech and startups, so the growth mindset. And, for me, I think one thing that's really important is that possibly playbook mindset. It's like, how do we come from that place of possibility? Because we don't know what the future holds, really. Especially, I think this year, 2020, has shown us a lot that we cannot predict. I had a whole plan for this year, but being adaptive and playing from that space. Okay, I might have a lot of things that are not out in my control right now. Like, I cannot control, the vaccine, for instance, right? And I cannot control the number of people wearing masks. So what do I have control over? What is possible for me in this time? And my husband and I have been talking a lot about this, like, how do we create that space for even both of us to thrive in our marriage and in our relationship right now amidst COVID and amidst the fact that we cannot go out and we cannot see friends the way we usually would?
Yeah.
how do we thrive and come from that place of possibility? So I think it's really the mindset and the skill sets,
Yeah,
but less of the jobs, because the jobs are going to change for sure.
that's
We don't even know what they're going to look like yet.
really good answer. Diana, just wanted to say thank you, Jay. We are so excited to listen to you. Very informative webinar. This is Diana from Armenia.
Thanks, Rihanna.
Excellent session. I think I'm just going to see if I have a couple of more questions for you. I mean, we do have questions. Some very, very good comments. Okay, so please comment on the role for Vimalana. What should be behavior? Joseph. There are more comments than questions. So, how to maintain long-term relationships as a leader by Hassan Gulfraz.
Okay, so how to maintain long-term relationships? I think this requires, I think another undervalued like practice as a leader is actually reflection. And I think I've had to intentionally incorporate this in my life more in the recent years. I always used to be, for me, I was always a doer. I prided myself on making things happen, on being out there and doing stuff, right? But I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of my board members who taught me about dream time, has shown me the fact that I need to reflect on why I'm doing what I'm doing too. I can't just be asking my organization this, but inspiring that from a place of like, I'm doing this work too. And I think relationships, maintain them long term. And I have this, to say also about networking. I think a lot of people maybe get exhausted by networking or feel like it's very superficial because they think I just have to do this so I can build my network, right? And then networking comes at a very surface level. But when you invest in relationships because you become genuinely curious about people, the earlier poll that we did where people said open-mindedness is important. I think open-mindedness when building relationships, you never know who you'll connect with, and I think the women entrepreneurship program that we were both on really showed us that too. People come from such diverse backgrounds, that openness when it comes to connecting with someone, I think is really important. But also understanding why I want to connect with people long term. Like, I think, why does this matter to me and to my work and to my life? And also just listen, not forcing relationships, I think is a big thing. Knowing that sometimes I'm sure you've met people where you just automatically like click and connect and like, and that stuff stays with you for a while. And I think that listening to, I think those interactions and what emerges from those interactions, being like, hey, I didn't think I was going to connect with this person, but it was really interesting and I would love to stay in touch. And knowing that it doesn't have to be like a regimented technical thing, but if you make, a real connection and a deep connection, that stuff sticks with people for a while. And they will come back, to you when they feel like they want to reach out. And I think social media in particular, a lot of people give social media like, I think a bad name because, they say like it's very consuming and all that stuff. But social media can be such a beautiful place to nurture those connections, to share what you're doing so that people in your community and your network know what's happening as well. And I found social media to actually be a really great way to kind of nurture those long-term relationships. Like yesterday I had a call with people. We spent 3 weeks, like 21 days in Central America 9 years ago, and I haven't seen them for 9 years, and we had a call yesterday, and it's because we've been keeping in touch with like Facebook and Instagram and everything. So never underestimate, I think, the power.
It's all about taking that step as well. I mean, you're right. I mean, after a while, even though you're friends, you don't just stay in touch knowing that the other person is just there. So you kind of like take that for granted. But it's all about just stepping out and just reaching out to different people. There's a good point, actually. You just mentioned social media. So Saira Salim is asking, how can we use electronic media and how can we use that to lead? So our behavior, question mark, polite or somewhat strict mostly? I didn't quite get that.
I think it really depends on maybe your context and the space you're in. So one of my mentors actually early on in my career told me that, you are in a space of like, media, social impact, and to not use my personal platforms to talk about this stuff would be a disservice to the work. So, I think that made me reflect, while I still like posting pictures of food, and feel free to connect with me, on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm quite like active there as well. It's just my name, Jiezhen. The perks of having a hard to spell, hard to pronounce name is means you can get all the handles that you need. But you know, I think apart from just posting those things, I think I've used social media as a way to reflect, a way to share about why we made certain decisions, to share, and from a very real, authentic place. You know, it's not about a PR comm strategy really, but really more about communicating why I'm doing what I'm doing, why is this important to me. Um, you know, so even when I was running organization, I would share updates, but through my personal lens. And I think that can really allow you to connect with the communities that you're working with, even with partners, you know. So a lot of our partners would follow us on social media as well, or follow me, and then they would see like, this is what I really care about. And it allows you to communicate and kind of nurture, like water the, you know, I see relationships as like a garden, right? And this is like watering the garden. You don't know who's going to walk by the garden on any given day, but like you're watering the garden with things from your own life. So I think never underestimate the power of social media to really communicate who you are authentically, even though it seems like it's a world of filters and a world of all this stuff, which is important too. Cute, you know, cute cat, great, like, you know, but I think it's like also how do we infuse some of who we are into our online profiles and make sure that that's aligned with our work. But I'm happy to do another session on that. I think that could be a whole nother session on its own.
And there's one on mindfulness as well that we talked about. So Numair Shahzada is asking, how can we rally people on a local community level to find courage and create change?
I think stories are really powerful, even at a local community level. And this can be online or offline. You know, human beings for as long as we can remember have, you know, been storytellers, and they've sat around fires, you know, and like told stories, right? I think stories inspire people. One of my favorite projects that we did in the Hidden Good was actually in Singapore, and it was actually no, we've done this a bunch of times with different communities, but we've done it we've told stories of people in the community that you wouldn't normally think, you know, had inspiring stories to tell, you know. So like you know, one of the schools, they told the stories of maybe their security guards or the canteen vendors, you know, in a school, like the lady who sells drinks, you know, and why she loves doing what she's doing. And maybe no one had ever asked her that before, but her story was so inspiring. She said, you know, just the ability to connect with students, to she loves like making sure that people are taken care of, and using that power of stories, whether it's verbal, so whether it's told, you know, maybe in, I don't know, the current situation in, you know, your community, whether you can physically gather, or even a lot of online stories tellings right now, right? If everyone shared like one story from their life, of someone that inspired them, those are, and it could be anyone, it could be like, you know, a family member, it could be you know, someone, a stranger in the community that maybe one day you decide to sit down and have a conversation with. So I think telling stories, whether online, offline, on Instagram, on Zoom, in person, are really ways in which that you can do this at a very local community level. It could be in a newspaper, you know, there are so many, there are the range of mediums and how you want to put it out. But the essence of it is that people connect to people at the end of the day. People don't connect to policies or products, they connect to the experience behind it and the people that they associate with it as well. So
yeah, that's true. So I have two comments. Dr. Basically, Komal Khatim Hussain is basically saying she's really impressed that women is encouraging for people for leadership. And then she's also saying, kindly shed some light on the role of communication in effective leadership.
Yeah, I think communication is key. I think I've seen so many times like great organizations putting in all the work, and they've done all the focus groups, and they've done like, you know, all the behind the scenes work, but if they don't communicate what they're doing, people will never know. And people get frustrated when they don't know, and they'll be like, oh, someone just made a decision on my behalf. And but I think that's why communication is key, and authentic communication, not communication just to get, you know, PR points, or like, you know, to get brownie points, but communication to really let people know where you're coming from. And this is a huge part of inclusion as well. I think when you communicate why you're doing what you're doing, and people get it, and they get why they were thought, that they get that they were also thought about in this process, it creates that environment of inclusion that we talked about earlier. But I think communication is key. And think about communication not just as what you're saying, but also what you're not saying. It's also what you're saying online. It's also how you carry yourself, like how you embody what you're sharing.
Yeah. I mean, Jai, so I have a couple of more comments here. I'm sure you can see the questions popping up as well. I do really want to do justice to everyone who signed in and who logged in and who is listening here. So we'll quickly just go through all of them. Some are comments, some are just appreciating how the session is going, and some are questions. Meher Khan is saying, I love hearing emerging leaders' perspectives. I believe in the growth mindset as a chair of the Center for Multi-Directional Engagement at the Society of Healthcare Innovation at University of Pennsylvania. I find your perspective very appropriate for the current times. Meher Khan. So thank you, Meher. Thank you for your comment. Cheyenne is saying, is emotional intelligence an important part for people in leadership positions? So maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, no, I think definitely. I think for a long time we valued, just regular intelligence, right? We're talking about IQ, and now, like, there's EQ. There's also digital intelligence right now, by the way, the digital quotient, DQ. Yeah, and because in the world that we live in right now, I think, for instance, social media can be a double-edged sword. I think a lot of times if we don't use it, it becomes, I think we need to be using it mindfully rather than letting it use us is the big thing. Making sure that, we use it mindfully. I think that is a part of being a mindful leader as well, so that it doesn't consume who we are. It's very easy to sit there scrolling. Trust me, I've done it,
Yeah.
But I think emotional intelligence is so key, because I think the world that we're at today is so educated. I know so many of my friends, like, in Pakistan, they have multiple master's degrees, or like, and it's such an educated, I think the world is more educated academically than we've ever been, right? But I think what sets a good leader apart from a great leader, and not just being a technical leader, but an adaptive leader, is that emotional intelligence, the ability to feel what people are feeling and to make a decision that best fits the present moment and the future and what they can see,
Yeah.
coming down
And
the road as well.
I think we keep coming back to being the mindfulness as well. If you're mindful of what role you need to play, what you need to say, what you need to think or feel, that really brings everything into perspective as well. Zohaib Khalid is asking, what is the most valuable thing you have learned so far about life? That's very deep.
Oh, so deep. Also, I just wanted to say, if you're using the chat, you have to turn it on to all panelists and attendees. If not, we only see your questions and other people don't see them. But most meaningful life lesson?
That you have learned so far?
I think it's really in that doing good doesn't have to look a certain way. I know that's the title of my TED Talk, right? But it's something that I think I've carried with me, that I've realized that doing good and leadership and being a woman doesn't have to look a certain way. There are so, I think, and that's where that whole possibility piece comes from, right? Is because I think too often we think that leadership needs to look like this. Education needs to look like this, like blank doesn't need to look a certain way. And honestly, I think I'm going to be launching, like, the Posse Playbook for real now, because after Harvard, I've just been sitting with this, and how do I bring this to the world? So stay tuned for that. Stay connected with me on, like, LinkedIn and Instagram, because that's coming soon. Because I think it's something that I think we've restricted ourselves for too long, of that, workplaces have to look a certain way. And I think it's challenging that, but not challenging it for the sake of challenging it, because I don't think that's constructive, but challenging it so that we find a new possibilities, right? And new beginnings and new avenues in which that we can engage the world in and come in with new and innovative solutions that the world needs. But yeah, I think it's that doing good can look like so many different things, and leadership can look, and not to constrain or push each other down because someone is not performing or showing up in the way that we think is the right way. And I think that's the heart of inclusion. Yeah.
Akib is saying, don't you think people mostly feel like feel artificial during networking exercises?
Oh, networking exercises. I think that's going back to the intention and the why, right? Like, so I feel like sometimes people show up. And here's the thing about like networking. I think effective networking, people can smell, you know, people can smell authenticity and inauthenticity. And if they know that you're just coming at them because you want to like, I don't know, like get their name card, you want them to introduce someone to someone and they feel like they're being used, chances are they're not going to want to talk to you for a very long time. But if you stay open and you stay curious, you know, as a lot of you selected, the open-mindedness is really important. I suggest you bring that to networking spaces as
Yeah.
well. If you're open and you're just like, actually tell me, I'm just curious about what you do. And I remember our first conversation. It was in the hotel in DC, and you were telling me about what you were doing in like Pakistan, and we were sitting like by the tables. And I remember, I was just very curious about what you were doing and like the work that you had been committing yourself to for the last number of years. And I think not just finding out what people can do for you, but also what you can do for them.
Yeah.
I think that can people see it and you think you might be very good at like, like hiding it. But at the end of the day, like I think people want to connect with people that they feel have that genuine connection with. And
Yeah.
networking, I think it's like, I know a lot of people, I think resist networking or feel like it's, a part of work that is so unnecessary and like a waste of time. But it's really relationships that I think form the bedrock of business, of collaborations, of
Yeah.
change that happens in the world. So I would say like don't like, but do it in a way that feels real and comfortable for you. I think it's important in education. We talk about your comfort zone and your stretch zone, which is right after that, and then the panic zone, because we always talk about comfort zone and out of comfort zone, but there's actually this magical area called the stretch zone. And I think when you're networking, you kind of want to be in your stretch zone. You want to be a little bit out of your comfort zone, but not at a place where you're panicking, because I know for some people networking induces like real panic. But yeah, I think it's to come at networking with a space of like, I'm just curious about getting to know, who you are, and doing it in a way that makes sense for you. So maybe you don't have to go to a big event, because big events sometimes are very scary, but you can meet people one-on-one. Right now, if we can meet people in person, you can connect with people on LinkedIn, drop them a message. I've had some calls that people have just reached out to me and be like, I think your work is very cool. Like, can we talk? And or they'll send me a message on Instagram. Networking, okay, again, going back to my whole premise, networking doesn't have to look a certain way either, and just embracing it in a way that makes sense for you and your situation.
That's true. I was reading this comment by Maria Iqbal. She's basically sharing her own story and experience. She's saying it's very frustrating working in countries where talking about diversity and inclusivity is like talking to the blind. I worked in the UK and then shifted to Pakistan and a few years back, and it's been really overwhelming working on projects in a province where there is no concept of inclusivity. So talking about this in a developed country is easy, but it's challenging yet tempting to work towards these issues where all of this is really needed. Sometimes
Yeah.
all this sucks up your energy and it's a tough one to continue or let go.
I definitely resonate with that. I think it's such a real concern, because I think a lot of the times we get caught up in the jargon and the language, right? So in Singapore, we don't use the word diversity inclusion. It's very common, I think, in the US, in the UK, like, I think she mentioned that she was in the UK previously, as well.
Yeah.
And I think these are concepts that are very common here, but not necessarily in Singapore. We don't talk about diversity inclusion, like, and so you want to find a language that makes sense for the community you're working with. I think a sense of like home, so a sense of where do you feel most at home? It's a concept that a lot of people can relate to, right? Where do you feel that, you feel welcomed? You can replace the word inclusion and diversity with words that make sense for the context that you're in. So, where do you feel safe? Where do you feel welcome? What makes you feel celebrated? These are words that I think are, can be adapted to different contexts. And so in Singapore, for instance, right, we worked a lot with youth, and a lot of young people, I throw out all this like, jargon and academic studies, it might not have resonated with them. So we often start with, what do you care about? What is something that you care about? And these could be, students that are in like the top school in Singapore. It could be youth on probation, from, the what we call the boys' home in Singapore or something. But there are so many ways that you can engage people if we learn, which is where I go back to that earlier point of learning to meet people where they are. Like what is their context? What matters to them? You know, like especially in working with rural communities, what matters to them in the context that they're in, you know, and meeting them where they are. And sometimes it's about tweaking the language. It might not look exactly the way that you learned it, but it's about tweaking. That's the adaptive leadership piece, is like, how do we tweak what we know to make sense for the groups and the communication that happens in the communities we're trying to serve. But thanks, that's a really good point. I think that in particular in Asia is, how do we make sense of this work in the context that we're in, and not just take the wholesale like concepts, you know, while I love growth mindset and Carol Dweck, you know, not just copy and pasting what, you know, comes from the West into, you know, Asia, but like developing our own frameworks and our own mindsets that make sense for us.
Yeah, that's true. We're still getting lots and lots of questions, but I feel like we're a bit over time as well, and I do feel like we won't be doing justice in order to answer all of them. What I'm going to do is quickly, we're going to send out a feedback form to all of our audiences. We would like to know what your experience was. What the questions that are remaining, I mean, I was just scanning through them and I was thinking most of them were around the entire discussion that we were having. So somewhere around the lines, I hope I hope you got your answers. But thank you. I mean, we're just going to send out a feedback form to all of you. And I hope that you can give us your feedback, tell us what you think. We had people from different countries signed in. We even had someone from Paris, I believe, or from France, because we had a couple of questions in French. We did not know how to answer them. So I'm really sorry about that.
I think they were asking, like, can we hear this in French? But yeah.
Can you read it?
Yeah, I speak French, but they were talking about, is it possible to hear this in French? You know, it's very interesting, but I'm not very good at English. Like, can we hear this in French? I don't know if we have, I mean, in the recording, you can probably use Google Translate and Google Translate.
Something of that sort, yeah. But no, thank you. No, and thank you for reading it out to us, because I was just wondering, I mean, how would we ever be able to find it?
Go écouter.
Yeah. But thank you so much for this session. I think time passed by. I did not even realize, and we just had a really nice discussion. I do feel like I'm going to call you over once again on the Founder platform, because we have a lot to talk about. There are a lot of things, that we still need to kind of like explore together. So I think we're going to do that. We're going to send out a feedback form, as I mentioned earlier, guys. So please do take out time just to fill that up. It's going to help us form these sessions better for you, and especially the content of it and how we can deliver it, even the time as well. So Jiezhen just put in her Instagram and LinkedIn profile in the chat section. So if you guys want to follow her.
No, we didn't get to all the questions today. So if you want to ask these questions, I'm always happy to answer them. And actually, I'll put the Posse playbook that is launching soon, so you guys will be the first to see it.
That'll be wonderful. That would be wonderful. Thank you. I mean, for all the questions that we've had, we just had about 10 people that we were not able to answer. So I'm really sorry about that. I feel bad, but we're a little over time. And it's morning for her. I hope that, I mean, I really think that she needs her morning coffee and breakfast as well. So Jiezhen, thank you so much for this. It was a pleasure having you on our platform. Thank you from Team Up, our teams, and from everyone in Pakistan and everyone who signed it from all over the world as well. Shanila is asking, how can I get it, the playbook? So I think that's on Instagram. If you just notice on top, Jiezhen just put in the Possibility Playbook profile on Instagram. So if you can just follow that. All right, thank you again. I hope you have a great morning, and I really, really would like to call you back again on this platform to
Thank you. No, this is great. It's a great way to start my day. So yeah.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Yes, stay in touch. Bye.
Of course. Bye-bye. Take care.